Okay, hello everyone. I'm Maddie Magneto-Quick, and I will be chairing this session. Just by way of introducing myself, I recently completed my PhD at Te Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, at the School of Design Innovation. My PhD focused on farms and farm animal sanctuaries as built worlds that we share with farmed animals. I conducted narrative analysis into the stories we tell about farmed animals, and then I ultimately used creative design research to explore and imagine new ways of building worlds with farmed animals outside of farming or farm animal sanctuaries that promise restorative justice and better care for farmed animals. I'm currently a lecturer in visual communication design with University of Wales Trinity St David, but I'm actually teaching this semester in Lanzhou, China, which is why this time zone works well for me. So that is enough from me. I'm very much looking forward to the three presentations in this session. And as has already been said, if you have any questions that come into your mind whilst the presenters are speaking, the link to the Padlet is on the side in the chat. And if you prefer to ask questions verbally, there'll be time to raise your hand at the end of each presenter. So to get underway, I will introduce our first speaker in this session. So we have Amie Johnstone. She is a PhD researcher at Edith Cowan University in Australia, and her presentation is titled To Sheep or Not to Sheep, Encouraging Empathy for Ovis Aries Through Storytelling. So Amie, whenever you're ready, you can take it over.
Hi everyone, I'm Amie, sheep enthusiast and PhD candidate at ECU in Perth, Western Australia, and welcome to my presentation To Sheep or Not to Sheep, Encouraging Empathy for Ovis Aries Through Storytelling. So this presentation draws upon my PhD project, which explores the representation of sheep in contemporary Australian children's literature through empathy. And my project blends creative writing, children's literature, and literary animal studies. And so today I'm going to discuss how the analysis of existing texts within the picture book and middle grade categories, along with the reading of animal studies texts and sheep cultural histories, influenced my writing of a young adult novel for my PhD project. And I'll also talk about some of the challenges I encountered when writing about farmed animals from a literary animal studies position. So trigger warning, there's no graphic images on the slides, but I do mention things throughout presentation like live export, mulesing, sheep illness, death, etc. But I'm not going to go into gory details. The sheep featured in the photos throughout the presentation are Lockie and the late Layla, my sheep family members. So why sheep? Why not sheep? The history of humanity is interwoven with sheep. However, many people may be unaware of the impact sheep and their byproducts have had on humans, such as their fibre being woven to make sails for ships, which allow people to travel. And humans also ate and continue to eat sheep flesh and even consume sheep milk. So while we often acknowledge our connection history of other non-human animals like horses and dogs, sheep are often overlooked or forgotten, invisible in the paddocks over yonder, or mostly thought about in connection with their body's byproducts. And my research project came about as I wanted to encourage young readers to reconsider how they thought about sheep and hopefully incite greater empathy towards sheep as individuals in the species. So numerous scholars have explored how stories can cause readers to feel empathy towards animals, as seen with classic animal stories like Black Beauty, and how stories can be more effective at changing readers' attitudes towards animals than data and facts. For example, the text Human Minds and Animal Stories, How Narratives Make Us Care About Other Species investigated the power and impact of animal stories and concluded with animal narratives do improve attitudes towards animals. So through a combination of research-led practice and practice-led research, I wrote a young adult manuscript titled More Than a Flock, which is narrated from the perspectives of two teenage girls, one who represents animal welfare position and the other who represents animal rights position. And the story revolves around the lives of sheep, the sentience of sheep, and sheep-human relations. So this quote is from William Wellstead's book, Writing for Sheep, Ecology, The Animal Turn of Sheep and Poetry. The quote resonated with me the more I immersed myself with the lives of sheep and wrote about them, because the more I realised how invisible they were to a lot of people. And as I mentioned, the goal of writing a sheep story was to encourage readers to experience greater empathy for sheep as a species and as individuals. And beyond this one sheep story I've written, I'm hoping other writers will consider how they represent sheep in children's literature and the impact that representation of sheep has on younger readers. So sheep frequently feature in children's literature titles, particularly picture books, and my initial investigation found over 90 titles in English language children's picture books that focused on sheep or where the main character was a sheep, and these stories were mostly written by Australian, British and American authors. And prior to writing my sheep-focused novel, I analysed a selection of children's books within picture book and middle grade categories that were published between 2004 and 2024, and these were written by Australian authors. And I also read animal studies texts and sheep cultural histories, which influenced some of my creative decisions from writing my project's novel. And throughout my PhD project, there's been numerous new sheep picture books published, and unfortunately most of them continue to promote the tropes and stereotypes identified as being assigned to sheep characters and narratives. So here's some of the ways sheep were frequently represented in picture books, and I'm trying to challenge these trope stereotypes with my own writing. And because the picture books I analysed, they continue to enforce the dominant discourse surrounding sheep in relation to these tropes. And Janae Dimmick, in her book And This Little Piggy Had None, challenging the dominant discourse on farmed animals in children's picture books, introduces the term desentinisation, which is the process of objectifying non-human animals. And desentinisation was present in most of these sheep picture books, thus distancing young readers from emphasising the species. And the middle grade titles I examined featured a young female human character and predominantly one named sheep character. And the sheep characters are often positioned as the girl's best friend, but I would suggest that these are more forced friendships since the sheep characters lack agency and don't really have a choice. It's be the girl's best friend or you're going to be eaten. And by drawing upon Amie Rattali's book, Animality and Children's Literature and Film, specifically the chapter Ethics and Edibility that explored Wilbur's sentience and E.B. White Charlotte's Web, I was able to identify how a singular sentience was applied to sheep characters of middle grade novels, so young readers were empathic about what happened to that one specific sheep. However, a consequence of this singular sentience was while the rest of the sheep in the stories was subjected to the usual farming activities such as shearing, mulesing, shipping and slaughter, the reader was encouraged to only focus on what happened to the hero sheep. So I've been reading all these sheep stories and they don't really challenge the dominant discourse surrounding sheep as farmed animals. And I also discovered that there weren't any Australian young adult sheep stories. So after analysing all these ones, I wrote the young adult one to try and rectify the injustices to sheep. So while I was writing the young adult novel, I ruminated on the responsibility of writing for and about sheep. And my goal was for young readers to feel greater empathy for the species and all the individual sheep characters, not just one sheep character. So I needed to avoid that singular sentience. And my story also aims to promote the sentience of sheep and explore sheep-human relations in a domesticated environment. And I wanted the story to challenge the dominant discourse surrounding sheep, but I needed to present the story in a way that it didn't attract the attention of censors, because I noticed books marketed as vegan or animal rights, they don't always get the shelf space in mainstream bookshops or the same promotional opportunities to reach readers outside of a community who are already aware of what sheep endure as farmed animals. And there are some farms mentioned in the story, but the main storylines occur on a non-farming property and at a farmed animal sanctuary. And this was a deliberate decision to separate sheep from only being associated with farms and as part of large flocks without any individual sentience or agency. And since I live with sheep, I'm immersed in their daily lives through caring for them and observing the interactions. But I live in what is now kind of a semi-rural area, which is bordered by rural agricultural businesses. So over the years, I've seen the trucks full of sheep going down the highway to the ports. They've gone north to the sale yards and abattoir. I've driven past the bare paddocks in summer, and then in the spring, you've got the ewes and lambs together. And writing the sheep story, it offered the opportunity to highlight these scenarios to readers, along with social justice issues impacting sheep, like live export and mulesing. and also the likes of the difficulty in obtaining timely medical care for sick sheep and dealing with the death of companion sheep, and also engage a bit with the ethical and sustainable wool debate. So writing for and about non-human animals, it carries a weight of responsibility in how we represent them in literature. And Joanna Lilly's chapter, Do We Have the Right to Write About Animals in Writing for Animals, discusses approaches to writing about animals with an emphasis on observation to help bridge the gap between the subjective and objective when humans write about animals. And Lilly referred to her suggested approach to find and watch an animal, bridge the distance, then write about as a whimsical method. However, I found observing sheep and spending undemanding time with them helped me more accurately capture sheep behaviour and personalities. So living with Lockie and Layla and observing their behaviour and the behaviour of neighbouring sheep informed the characterisation of sheep in my novel to present readers with more authentic portrayal of sheep behaviour than what's conveyed in the picture books and middle grade books. For example, the behaviour of sheep when they're unwell, or the flock dynamics at meal times, behaviour when they're relaxed versus alert, what happens when it starts raining. And unlike in the illustrated sheep in picture books, these fictional sheep actually move and sound like real sheep. They're not walking on their hind legs, there's no karate kicks or anything. And the naming and individual characteristics of sheep characters were highlighted throughout the story. For example, the sheep who live with the animal rights character, their names are Rosie, Trevor, Daisy, Dandy, Laurie, Lily, Skip, Basil, and Einstein. And the sheep and other farm species at the farmed animal sanctuary are also named as are sheep who have homes for life and other properties. And these sheep and their lives are contrasting with the farm sheep who exist as a unit within the flock. And I actually used a secondary character called Ali and her sheep Anna to demonstrate the problem of singular sentience near the end of the novel following a sheep truck crash, which resulted in the death of numerous sheep, in hope that young readers would recognise that by prioritising one sheep over the rest of the sheep, Ali caused all the other sheep to suffer injuries or die. So this is how I'm pitching Royal and Flock to publishers. 2 teenage girls, a flock of sheep, and a series of ill-fated events during the spring school holidays lead to an increasingly hostile response from the local community, which tests loyalties and leads to the loss of loved ones. So as I mentioned before, one of the characters represents animal welfare, the other represents animal rights and is vegan. So human characterization, the animal welfare character, Charlie, she moves to the rural town from the suburb city, and the animal rights vegan character, Danya, she grew up in the rural town and she's a bit of a pariah due to her beliefs. And language choices, they reflect Danya's immersion in the daily lives of sheep, and Charlie as an urban-raised teenager learning about sheep via Danya and other people in the area. The way Danya talks and thinks about sheep is also informed by animal studies texts and some sheep cultural histories. So for example, when she's thinking or talking about the sheep she lives with, she refers to them as everyone, he, she, they, them, or by the individual name. In contrast, Charlie thinks and talks about sheep as the sheep, the ewe, a lamb, it, a flock, though there is some evolution in how she refers to Danya's sheep by name and uses she, he instead of it by the end of the story. And Charlie's also exposed to different ways sheep are treated in comparison to Danya's sheep, who are considered companion sheep, and the sheep who live at a sanctuary. Charlie witnesses dead sheep in paddocks, a shearing contest in town, a lamb being killed at a barbecue, and then the sheep truck crash at the end. So the exposure to all these different lives of sheep works to push her and hopefully the reader towards reevaluating how they thought about sheep and emphasizing with sheep. And the difference in the narrative voice between the girls and how they perceive sheep works to juxtapose those different positions when caring about and for sheep. So I drew upon my immersive practice of living with and caring for sheep for Danya's point of view, but Charlie's naivety about what happens to sheep is informed through what I've experienced from talking about sheep to non-sheep people over the years, and from overhearing how farmers talk about sheep. And as part of my observation during the drafting of the novel, I recorded notes on sheep interactions in my writing journal, such as sheepish encounters or caring for sheep when they're unwell. And these notes then fed into the scenes throughout the novel, such as Danya's concerns about sheep when they're unwell, because it is difficult to get a sheep vet out here and there's limited treatments available. And her determination to stay up all night for sick sheep during a storm, treat them, which she further draws Charlie into the world of sheepiness. So during this project, I came across the debate surrounding anthropomorphism and its use in children's animal stories. So scholars have varying opinions about the advantages and disadvantages of anthropomorphism and whether it's beneficial or harmful for non-human animal characters. For example, Stacey Holt-Saras in The Methodology of the Animal Farm and Children's Literature Over the Fence lists anthropomorphism as one of the thematic devices often used in children's books, and she cautions about the use of it as it can be misleading when animals are portrayed with human-like behaviours and lifestyles, as it can contradict any welfare concerns for real animals. And the concerns raised by Holt-Saras and other literary animal studies scholars reinforces the ethical responsibilities writers hold when writing about and for animals. However, some other scholars like Copeland and Bryan note that while writers have an ethical responsibility to provide accurate representations of animals amidst navigating ingrained social and cultural codes, the anthropomorphism does have a significant impact on children's literature containing humane themes, as it assists young readers learn about and emphasize of different species. So the overall message was be mindful of the impact anthropomorphism may have on a species and readers' perceptions of the species. So how did I apply anthropomorphism in writing my own novel? Since the story is aimed at a young adult audience, specifically around the ages 12 to 15, there are not any talking sheep or chapters from the sheep's perspective that you might see in animal stories aimed at much younger readers, which led to the challenge of preventing the story becoming overly anthropocentric. So through the teenage characters of Danya and Charlie, the sheep's characters' behaviours are anthropomorphized to an extent, such as when Eva, a girl, projects a supposed emotion onto the sheep when something good, bad, or funny happens. However, these are their reactions to sheep interactions or behaviour. And Danya's immersion in sheep lives feeds into how she perceives sheep, how she perceives sheep should be cared for, and how the sheep she lives with feel about certain things like a new bale of hay or the shelters around the property. And anthropocentrism, it was something I was acutely aware of during the drafting of the story because it is narrated from a human's perspective. The story is about and for sheep, and Danya's character in particular was used to challenge the belief that humans are the most important species or that everything should revolve around them, because her life revolves around caring for sheep and liberating them when possible. Except as a domesticated species, the sheep in the story are still confined by the environment humans keep them in. But this is just my first sheep story. It fits within children's literature field, so I felt I needed to adhere to some genre conventions, such as the readership age and talking animals, in order to be a bit more successful at trying to get it published and in readers' hands. And I'll continue experimenting with writing for and about sheep, the goal of changing readers' attitudes towards them. So maybe in the future, I could write from a sheep's perspective, a bit like how German author Leonie Swan did with 3 Bags Full, a sheep detective story, and narrate in a way that connects with readers and causes them to care more about and for sheep. So this is a quote from Charlie's perspective in More Than a Flock, when Charlie and Danya are caring for 6 sheep during the storm and all the other sheep have joined them in the shed. It's also where I pulled the story's title from. I tried to keep the sheep puns to a minimal, but thank you for listening to me talk about sheep and sheep stories. And please let me know of any sheep stories you'd recommend reading that are written by authors outside of Australia. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to our second presenter in this session. So we will have Saikat Pradhan. He is a PhD researcher at the University of North Bengal in India, and his presentation is looking at India in an era of ecological precarity, exploring the need for interspecies kinship and care ethics in Shaunak Sen's All That Breathes. So Saikat, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and get going.
I'm actually not going to be sharing any PPT, so I'm just going to be reading and explaining what I prepared. So, can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, just a minute. Um, yes. So first of all, thank you, Maddie, for the introduction. I am Saikat Pradhan, a PhD student in English at the University of North Bengal, as she said. And my presentation is entitled Looking at India in an Era of Ecological Precarity, Exploring the Need for Interspecies Kinship and Care Ethics in Shaunak Sen's All That Breathes. Now, I just want to mention one thing. that this presentation of mine is not directly related to my PhD research, but it does draw on issues that I explore in my research. So without much further ado, let me begin the presentation. As humans have evolved as a species and gradually assumed power and knowledge over other creatural life, exerting dominance on non-human nature has been one of humanity's most consistent traits, something which has ranged from simple subordination to outright cruelty, even termination of other species for survival, whether through meat consumption, accumulation of capital, or satisfying other fundamentally quote unquote human needs. In fact, our current geological epoch of the Anthropocene is viewed by many as the peak of this long-standing history of human intervention on non-human life forms, i.e., animals, plants, insects, and other phenomena of a more than human kind, thus bringing about catastrophic climate change and planetary precarity. In this paper, I argue how Indian filmmaker Shaunak's portrayal of the non-human other poses fundamentally existential questions that not only entail human and more than human life worlds, but also everything that lies in between. In the 2022 film, depicts two Muslim brothers' relentless efforts to help cure the injured black kites that are regularly plummeting from the polluted skies of New Delhi. Being synanthropic and synurbic, migratory black kites or Milvus migrans are integral to the vulnerable ecosystems of the national capital, but are now facing rapid biodiversity loss and species extinction as a result of growing anthropogenic derangement of nature. Chen's film is saturated with productive human-animal encounters, by drawing attention to which I seek to call into question time-honored human exceptionalism that has invariably sustained the hegemonic edifices of humanism and anthropocentrism. One of the opening shots of the film brilliantly shows a black kite flying in the distance while the sky is divided into neat boxes by black electric wires, a perfect example of trans-species entanglement in a capitalist technoculture to my mind. Another such example can be found in a scene that shows a centipede coming out of a pothole, which simultaneously catches the reflection of an aeroplane flying overhead. By showing the transgressive effects of human-non-human interface, I argue that Shen's documentary embraces a vision for a holistic and inclusive planetary futurity, where ideas of interspecies kinship, planetary ethics, and a harmonious coexistence between all forms of flora and fauna are a reality. French thinker Michel Serres importantly speaks of destruction of non-human life worlds that can result in the destruction of human habitats, depletion of food resources, intensification of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere, thus contributing to overall planetary precarity and species extinction. My approach aligns with Serres in that one of the preventive measures to climate crisis can be found in a quote-unquote natural contract. One, which proposes a non-parasitic, synergic, and reciprocal exchange between human and non-human nature. One that can have far-reaching implications, especially in the age of the Anthropocene. And one which Shen's documentary appears to project brilliantly. Here, one might also think of Donna Haraway's notion of companion species in consideration of the possibility of cohabitation and mutual care as depicted in Shen's film. At one point in the film, Saud, the elder brother, interestingly mentions, and I quote, "Every kite has a code, but code breaking is natural today. Every life form adjusts to the city now. Rats, pigs, frogs, mosquitoes, turtles, insects, and cows and horses all improvise and adapt to the city." Unquote. This definitely suggests that we are not created as antinomies, but as co-constituents on Earth, as Haraway writes in her 2007 text, "When species meet," and I quote, "we are constitutively companion species. We make each other up in the flesh, significantly other to each other. In specific difference, we signify in the flesh a nasty developmental infection called love. This love is a historical aberration and a natural cultural legacy." Unquote. I'd now like to focus on certain images that are related to the agency of the non-human animal in the film, especially when the younger brother and the black kite are facing each other. This may remind us of, um, you know, although in a different context, of French philosopher Jacques Derrida's encounter with the cat, whose quote-unquote response left the philosopher baffled. Here it may be argued that the superior gaze of the human is subverted by the agency and alterity of the kite's gaze, as evident in the scene. One of the brothers states that the black kites look like furious reptiles from another planet, um, thus highlighting their otherworldliness and alterity. There are numerous shots in the film which arguably reassert and reinscribe the agency of the migratory creature. Attempts to deconstruct the fundamentally human in Shen's documentary is either effected through a total exclusion of applying human nomenclature to non-human animals, thus resisting an attempt to colonize them, or via indigenous religious beliefs. Indian theorist Nandini Thiagarajan observes that members of different religious communities in India tie empathy to religious views about kites and animals in general. Whereas in Hinduism, the act or event of reincarnation leads to reverence for all beings, Islam regards kites as sacred winged emissaries, therefore considering them precious life forms who can take away worries, fears, etc. In fact, as Thiagarajan explains, there's a long Islamic tradition for treating animals as equals. This is particularly evident in a scene in the film where South says that, and I quote, "It is said that feeding kites earns sawab, S-A-W-A-B, sawab, which means religious credit," unquote. While discussing encounters with caged animals in zoos in his seminal essay, Why Look at Animals, John Berger argues that however you look at these animals, even if the animal is up against the bars, less than a foot from you, looking outwards in the public direction, you are looking at something that has been rendered absolutely marginal, and all the concentration you can muster will never be enough to centralize it. Quite contrary to this, I argue that Shen's documentary talks about an open cage, a cage which is built for keeping and nursing the injured black kites, only to liberate them again, to let them return to their natural habitats rather than turning them into caged animals. One which may be said to deconstruct the so-called Western taxonomies of capturing, categorizing, and caging. South, in Shen's film, states that when he and his brother first found those injured black kites, they went to a nearby bird hospital for treatment. However, to their surprise, the authorities refused them since it was a non-vegetarian bird. Therefore, they started using their basement as a bird hospital and then built an open cage on the roof for avian treatment. Recent cultural criticism has shown how spaces of ruins and ruination, damaged ecologies on Earth, can become productive spaces for interspecies encounters. Rather than viewing the vacant lot as an unhygienic, unproductive space for human-animal interactions, Ten's film, I think, turns, at least on aesthetic and representational levels, uh, garbage heaps and trash dumps as theoretically potent means of imagining trans-species entanglement. In fact, all that breeds can be said to demonstrate American anthropologist Anna Singh's reflections on ruined ecologies. That is, living in and with ruins can help us understand entanglement, as well as yield new multi-species and multicultural life. The film importantly opens with the image of a garbage heap teeming with different creatural life, especially rats scuttling by and mosquitoes in stagnant water. Another interesting scene in the film captures baby turtles in trash dumps. This viewpoint, I argue, may be significant in grappling with the uncertainty and uneasiness with the ambivalence surrounding debates on green use or the attempt to create a green world, and offer an interesting take on Shen's documentary. Following ecological thinker Peter Vermeulen, one might argue that the Anthropocene is, and I quote, less a problem to be solved than a new reality to be inhabited, unquote. No matter the extent of human-made ecological damage, nature will always find ways to rejuvenate herself. Interestingly, in one of the more perceptive scenes, the elder brother South states that before black kites, there were vultures to eat the trash or plastic rubbish. If the black tides go extinct, nature will find some other agent to resume the task. As South says, I quote, nature will always find a way to absorb waste, unquote. This is, however, not to endorse or support environmental destruction or human pillaging of the earth further. I think that the last scene of Shen's film brilliantly demonstrates the need for interspecies kinship in an era of acute planetary precarity, beckoning us to elicit a caring attitude, a certain moral culpability towards other creatural life. My analysis ultimately underscores that the film's implication is that non-human animals should best be encountered in their animality or animosity, free from any anthropomorphized, epistemically violent, or culturally distorted representation. The film, to my mind, supports Derrida's critique of the anthropomorphizing of non-human animals. The two brothers go to great lengths in saving non-vegetarian black guys who sometimes can take away Nadim's glasses or can attack other inhabitants of the city. All the shots in the film, which focus on particular animals and insects like rats, pigs, frogs, centipedes, mosquitoes, and so on, project these life forms in their animality, free from any cultural modification or distortion. Even though primarily about a single creature, that is, the black kite in New Delhi, the film ultimately makes the suggestion that all life forms on Earth should be considered equally, without any sense of discrimination, by moving beyond the propensity to induce violence or cruelty to other than human lives. One of the most illuminating lines of dialogue in the documentary is given below, and I quote, life itself is a kinship. We are all a community of air. One shouldn't differentiate between all that breathes, unquote. Thank you.
Okay. We will move on to the third presentation in this session, and this is by Altamush Saeed, who is a master's researcher at the Lewis and Clark Law School in the USA. His presentation is entitled Interspecies Justice and Disasters, Protecting Human and Animal Lives in the Age of the Anthropocene. So Altamush, whenever you're ready, I'll let you go ahead.
Firstly, thank you so much to the organizers and to these fascinating presentations. I particularly loved the last two. I was really happy to listen to those, and I hope this is equally as engaging for the audience. Some of you have heard a different version of this. It's quite similar, but I have added a few new things, more perspectives. But for those who don't, I think it would be an interesting perspective to think about. So the topic, as I mentioned before, is interspecies justice, which is kind of like a theory that connects or acknowledges that we're not alone on this planet, which is basically why all of my presentations start with this basic acknowledgement that I wrote last year. I'm always try to make it better. So if anybody has suggestions on the wording, do let me know because and now I think the animals are equal co-authors of this acknowledgement as well, something that I learned today. So the thing is we're not alone on this planet and there's a reason why that is, but many occasions we don't see that. We don't see literally our co-authors or co-living species on the planet who have a very much important role just like we do in making sure that life goes on in a way, for them, for us, and for the environment. And that is something that's really huge, something that we don't see, particularly in my country where I'm from Pakistan, where I'm currently working in right now. It is often really hard for people to see beyond outside their homes, to see and go outside and see dogs and cats, and see that their needs are not being met, for example. And going beyond is even harder. Like, for example, farm animals, that might be hard. Going even further beyond thinking about insects, that might be hard for some of us here as well. So it's just, it's a degree, but it has to start from somewhere. And and the starting point, of course, is an acknowledgement that we're all here together. And then the environment as well. I'm just going to borrow a few words from Saikat's presentation, but I do believe the environment is sentient as well because all of these feedback mechanisms of how it's going to make sure that the world stays is a sign of sentience. It's different in from animals, of course, because of the inability to feel pain and suffer mentally. But a very good example of that is, of course, the five mass extinctions, which were essentially the greatest disasters that this planet has ever seen, which I'm sure all of you do know about in some context. But those disasters were basically a resetting mechanism that the Earth used essentially to make sure that lives on. And I think that's one of the purposes that we kind of see as what's our goal here. I know we have individual identities, individual destinies, and animals do the same. But at the end of the day, it's about making sure that life exists on this planet. And that's how everything has been designed in a very careful way. Of course, we can think differently, but from what I've seen, I kind of agree with it. And this picture is actually from a flood that happened in my country 2 years ago in Pakistan. I was in the field working on the ground, and normally what we see in this era of Anthropocene, this human exceptionalism, again borrowing some words, um, is that the only victim that we see when we think about these disasters or we think about generally in the world is just human beings. And that's okay because for some of us, that's where our lived experience can take us. But we have to think beyond. And that is precisely why disasters actually happen. But before going there, this is normally what we see. We don't see this. So this is the same side of the same disaster where we understand and acknowledge that animals can be equal victims. And since this flood was mostly happening in rural areas, cats and dogs mostly were not affected, so they're not here. Farm animals were affected the most. And just to give us tiny context, this flood happened 2 years ago, not too long. And one third of my country was actually underwater at one point. Over a million farm animals had died, and over 1,700 human beings died as well. And there was devastating loss that's, we're still recovering from. And before that, in 2020, the world had a zoonotic disaster, another type of disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a serious problem. And now we're all working on preventing these things and thinking about this. But before I move forward, this is what I added, and it's a question to all of us. You don't have to answer, but be honest. How many of you would not be willing to leave a disaster zone if your cat and dog was left behind? I am hoping many of you would say yes. Would you do the same if it's a farm animal that you own? Um, I'm hoping some of you will say yes here. And then, would you do the same if it's a farm animal that you eat and I don't know nothing about? I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable, but of course, I should have given a trigger warning in this question. But what about that? What if you don't have a connection with the animal and it's just something different, something you put on your plate? And lastly, what's disaster from an animal perspective? What would a disaster be for an insect, for example? This was just a question that just, I was thinking. Because normally, whenever we define anything, it is from a human perspective. And my presentation is from a human perspective as well, because, that's how it is. And should it be? I hope I can say no, but how would then we define disaster from an insect perspective? Maybe for an insect, cutting a leaf, for example, would be equivalent to a disaster because they spend most of their entire lives on that space. Maybe that's a disaster for that being. We need to think about these things, or if we haven't, we should. But before delving in this anthropocentric framework of disasters, I want to make it more natural, more the way it is. And I think the best starting point to that is, of course, challenging the idea that there are no such things as natural disasters. This is a terminology that we're taught since, we go in primary grade or middle school and it keeps on going. And this is the same narrative that our governments use to basically tell us that there's nothing we can do about it. So it's natural. But was it? Uh, because disasters are not just a single day event. It's not just that the heat wave that happens across the world, or flooding happens in Pakistan or in Nepal, or an earthquake happens in Morocco or in Turkey last year, and things keep on happening. It's not just that day, that's about that, and that's normally what we think about. It's actually an entire process, and it keeps on happening. Disasters, in essence, actually have a cycle. So what we normally see is, of course, the response phase. This is when the disaster has already happened. But there are quite a few things that need to happen before. Firstly is the prevention phase, which is basically if we don't do things, we are essentially causing the disaster. We're going against mitigation, essentially. But if we do so, we can prevent them as well. It's the same concept. Then, of course, after we've done that, we will implement those things and be better prepared. For example, early warning systems as an idea in rural areas across the world. If people knew that something was going to happen, maybe they can be better prepared. Maybe they can, leave with their animals. For example, how many of you know of any animal shelter that exists on the face of this earth that has a space for both women and their animals? That has a space for both humans and their animals. How many? I know very few. There's one in California because a legislation was passed a few years ago, last year actually. But those frameworks are quite important and needed for us to make sure that we have these spaces where we can prevent and prevent loss of life as well. Because when a disaster actually happens, it's almost always too late. And but the thing is, that's where all the action is for some reason, because it's about political philanthropy, political charity. Everybody comes up, the UN comes up, your government comes up, your big nonprofits come up, and then they become heroes, saviors, which is a complex that I do not associate with because I don't think we can save anyone. We can be there for someone, but never save them. And that kind of causes a lot of waste of resources, and those people who have, or those beings who have lost everything are never going to be able to recover, which is so ironic. But the next phase after response is recovery, because you have to make sure that you create mechanisms or build back better in ways that those things do not happen again. However, the problem with recovery is that it is happening after a disaster. It should have happened before. I know we have to do this, but still, policies that are made at the time of disaster are specific to that particular disaster. And then what we do is we apply those same policies to everything in disasters, which causes further problems. The other thing that I want to explain, which is a bit technical, but I think language is really important. And so disasters generally come with three particular words that are really important for every one of us to remember. The first one is hazards. So hazards are actually the event. That is not a disaster. A disaster is basically the life cycle that I just showed you. A hazard is, for example, the flood or the earthquake. So it's quite different. What causes disasters is the interplay or relationship between exposure and vulnerabilities. So if you think about elderly women, or if you think about children, or you think about people with disabilities, or of any kind, and if you think about animals, they have a higher tendency of vulnerability. And increasing their exposure, or basically not doing something that limits a disaster exposure, for example, by not creating building codes, for example, as an easy example, where you do not erect or create earthquake prone buildings, you're basically going to create exposure. And those beings who have a higher vulnerability will suffer even more. And these things are kind of really important. And of course, the other things that I'm not going to cover today, but the main thing that leads to a better, good disaster response is having trust between the community, having better communication, because those lines are kind of always crossed or dilapidated when a disaster actually happens. The last thing, which is the most important one, is prediction or precautions. Since there are no such thing as natural disasters, we cause them if we actually think about them by our activities, by our actions. For example, climate change is human induced. This is true from the sixth report from the IPCC, which is the UN scientific body, where they basically directly say that climate change is human induced. So I'm not making it up. But if it is, that means it's predictable. That means there are some precautions that we can take. For example, in cases of earthquake, we cannot predict where the earthquake will actually happen. But we have science available that suggests that there are fault lines, particular fault lines, where something could happen. So around those areas, you could develop better building codes. You could think about maybe building shelters that are for both humans and animals and things of the like. Of course, you need expertise, but that's the idea. But that idea creates responsibilities because now you know. and you have a responsibility to others, not just humans, but animals as well, and the planet too. From a very animal perspective, the language in this slide is very anthropocentric, and I hope you have noticed that much of the language that I've used in these questions and everything is anthropocentric. It's for a reason, and I will cover that up very shortly. So, from a purely animal perspective, but in anthropocentric language, there's a destruction of habitats. There's, of course, displacement of animals. Uh, Oil spillage, for example, causes a lot of marine damage, and aerial life is affected as well. Because for those who have studied birds, they will know that birds have this amazing super respiratory system, which is the reason why they're able to fly miles across the world. With climate change, their breeding patterns are changing, right? So they don't know when to migrate, and that causes a lot of problems, which affects the food web, which affects biodiversity, which has, by the way, been lost by over 75% in the last 50 years. That's insane. And so it causes a huge impact because the circle of life, this idea that we're all connected, is something that we often forget, which we should not. And if we think from a highly anthropocentric perspective, which I think we should from a realistic perspective, because that's how the world listens, that's how the world cares. And if we can become these selfish human beings, and I think that way we can protect not just ourselves, but the animals as well and the environment as well. So from a very anthropocentric framework, this question, how do we feed the expected 10 billion human population by 2050? Because that's what's predicted. And right now we're facing severe food security issues across the world. What would we do then? And secondly, to get there, how do we combat the impacts of climate change and avoid disasters and therefore ensure human survival? Another anthropocentric framework. But we have to, and that ensures human survival. But as a result, it also ensures the survival of the planet and the animals as well. From the international setting, this is something you don't need to understand or see, but the only thing that I will refer to this is that this is the framework that dictates disaster risk reduction at the UN level, the United Nations. And so every country follows this. It's not binding, but it's a soft declaration that people will follow. And the language is mostly drafted by an agreement between the states. And the reference that animals get in this framework is basically of livelihood, where it says that the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in life, livelihoods, and health, and the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. So animals are essentially property in this disaster risk framework because they're referred to as firstly as assets or livelihoods, which kind of always gives them that second status when it comes to think about their protections in these kinds of disasters. But things can change. And the first question that I ask you, how many of you would be willing to leave your animals behind, your cats and dogs, particularly in a disaster zone, was a question that, people answered in 2006. This is from Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2006, and there were a lot of losses in the U.S. I'm not focused on that part, but people were literally unwilling to leave disaster zones because their cats and dogs would die. They literally stopped. And that was the reason why we basically had the world's first ever animal welfare protection statute in disasters, which came from the US. It was only focused on cats and dogs because the law is unfortunately always about limiting scenarios, and that's what it wanted to do. And of course, the industry would have never wanted farm animals to be covered here. However, that really happened. And this is why one of the most important reasons or ways we can use to advocate for animal rights in disasters is starting with companion animals because of this amazing human animal bond. Of course, I'm going to be critical of it. It is anthropocentric, but still, it helps animals and we should use it. And that's what people did because this is quite a hard war that we're all fighting and we have to create these spaces. Eventually, in the US, another law was passed in 2022 which was basically about cross collaboration, which is called the Planning for Animal Welfare Wellness Act, where different industries, like the FEMA industry and other industries, which are basically responsible for disaster response, other vulnerable groups coming together and developing some kind of a plan that ensures that all of their needs are met, and especially animals' needs are met as well. So it's just more about cross collaboration, nothing more, but still really important. The last act, of course, has not passed. It's something that was introduced in the US Congress last year and the year before that as well, which is the Industrial Agriculture Accountability Act, which basically suggests that factory farming is the major reason why we have disasters, and therefore we should ban them on that point. Of course, it didn't pass, and we all know why it did not pass, but still, somebody pushed it in the Congress, and that's amazing, and I think we should acknowledge that. I will explain these points now through some case studies, one of them, of course, from my own country. This is a flood that happened 2 years ago. I have already given the context. One-third of the country underwater. Over 1,700 human beings had died. Over 12,000 people were injured across the nation. And over 1.1 million farm animals died. I generally tend to avoid the term livestock, but of course that's what we use, but we have to acknowledge that, and that's okay. So 1.16 million farm animals died, and the only reason that number was calculated, guess what? Again, because they are property, and so humans have a monetary advantage, towards them. That's why this data was collected. And then guess what? No data was collected for any other animal in disasters. In fact, the disaster management policy has nothing on animals at all in Pakistan. Why? Of course, I've already answered that, but let me know what you think about it. And then at the same time in 2022, in after August, when the floods had already happened, there was research going on at the Imperial College of London in the UK. I hope so, it's UK. Yeah, it is, of course. So there was research there which basically suggested that these projections, which is basically about the predictability point that I raised, was that it's all connected and people actually knew what was going to happen. So in a way, people knew. And whenever my government says that they could not prepare for it, they don't know, is inherently wrong, of course. But to create an atmosphere where you can say these things, we need a lot of people, a lot of ideas coming together. And so the research also said that, of course, we cannot pinpoint an exact correlation as to how much climate change was responsible for the global warming effect, which eventually led to the massive flooding. But there was a relationship, and that's true. And which basically takes me to my last point, which is about the food system, something that we see and understand, but we kind of don't see how difficult the food system really is. So many of us might be against the way the food system works as of now. I hope so. But the thing is, many of us might not know how complex the food system really is and what we're asking of it. So we want the food system to solve the problem of food security, which is problematic, but of course, because I will explain that very shortly, and we're also asking it to create a healthy and nutritious livelihood for other people, to make sure public health is not affected, to make sure animals don't suffer, to make sure climate change doesn't happen. And lastly, of course, to make sure that people have some kind of a livelihood from the system as well. The food system, folks, is very complicated. So normally we just say that, there is just, harms coming in, the environmental harms, which is the greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, so on and so forth, which are so many. But the thing is, the nodes that exist within the food system are also so many, and which is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing, which means that we can create more opportunities or possibilities of changing or reforming our food system, the way we do things. Food loss and waste is something that's been picked up by many countries across the world because if you save food, essentially, you can feed more people. But why don't apply that same argument on maybe changing the whole food system to something different, like increasing plant-based, for example, from a very scientific perspective, not from other perspectives, and maybe improving transportation. Maybe animals don't have to suffer that much. Pakistan has no law at all on animal transportation. Many countries don't. And for those who do, there's a very archaic law which says that in a period of 28 hours, animals have to be rested, every 9 hours, given food and water, and that's it. But there is no implementation. Anything can happen on the road. So these are quite big complications, and the food system is a mammoth. But we can use it. We can pick something that we understand and move forward with it. But the reason why I said that maybe we could consider plant-based food systems is because of the calorie loss that happens. This is from UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, which says that for every 100 calories that we feed to animals, basically, and destroy and cause deforestation, take away biodiversity, affect bioorganisms under the ground and over, um, to basically grow food for those animals. And then when we eat those animals, we only get 17 calories out of it. So almost 85% is lost, which could eventually be fed to other people who are suffering from acute food security across the board. We would actually fix food security this way if we think differently. But of course, why the food systems are directly linked to disasters, that's because 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system alone. That's massive. And 70% of those come from the animal agriculture system. As I mentioned before, the land is used basically to grow food for the animals. And of course, it covers plant-based already, but 50% of our global land is used for agriculture. That's too much. Uh, from the animal agriculture system, mostly 70% of our global freshwater withdrawals are used, and it is causing 78% of eutrophication, which is basically algae buildup, taking away of oxygen and making it really hard for the oceans to work as carbon sinks, which causes problems for all of us. And biodiversity, of course, has been affected. 75% of global biomass is just farm animals, which is insane, and wild animals are just less than 6%. So that is insane, and that is why the whole food web is getting affected. For those who have not seen a factory farm, this is what it looks like for animal agriculture. And of course, lastly, the other few points that are kind of scary, but we need to understand is that the disaster framework is actually quite big. So the IPCC says that, and this is from the Paris Agreement that many countries have already agreed on, is that if things go as usual, and they only refer as and they refer food emissions and fossil fuels, is that we will never achieve the 1.5-degree target, and we're already at 1.3. And for countries like mine, a 0.1-degree change means those devastating floods. For the global north, it's quite different, but we need to see those parallels. And the UNDRR office says that as well, by 2030, we will have at least 560 disasters per year. And additionally, 37.6 million people will go into extreme poverty. So the food system causes a lot of problems, from environmental racism, dietary racism, child labor, mental health. But the main one that I want you all to understand is intergenerational equity. And that's important because floods or disasters are the reason why we have food security problems. And then to solve those food security problems, we go back to the same food systems that I just critiqued. And those same food systems then cause the same food security problems by causing floods or any other kind of a disaster, which creates this cycle. And for countries who cannot solve these problems in better ways, they're kind of stuck. My country is stuck, for example. I'm assuming other countries are stuck as well, and this is something we need to change if we want to avoid disasters. So I wrote a paper on how we can quantify animal disaster protections from a framework perspective. I'll share that in the chat. It's quite complicated, but I think we need some kind of a system where we can put all these loop factors in and then see how can we create better measures of better protection mechanisms. So I'll leave this one out because I'll share my paper and you can look it up. And of course, recommendations, as I mentioned before, would be updating this cruel system, understanding the connections between food security, climate justice, and disasters, and creating policies where animal deaths, for example, are collected, and there's traceability in how we do things. A bit complicated, but these are some basic things that we can do. And essentially, anthropocentrism or human exceptionalism is kind of incompatible with interspecies justice and climate justice. This is where I put the solution at the end, which is basically an acknowledgement that we're all connected. And when we basically interact with another life form, we're acknowledging that they have their own intrinsic rights. And when that really happens, this kind of food system cannot exist because it violates the rights of not just animals, but the environment and humans as well. So interesting. But we don't see it that way. And then I just reframe those same questions that I asked before, but this is from a zoological perspective. Would your cat or dog leave you behind in a disaster zone? I don't know if a study has happened, but I'm pretty sure the answer would be zero. Would your farm animal, a sheep, that is your family member, leave you behind in a disaster? Think about it. And would an animal that knows nothing about you, a farm animal, leave you behind? For this question, think about the idea that can the farm animal actually leave? Because right now we don't have any policies when we discuss factory farms or these food systems. Because what happens is that normally across the world, we have subsidies available for farmers or these mega factory farm holders to let their animals die and then get a subsidy per head of the animal deaths. So does it even have a choice? What's disaster from a human perspective? I already answered that because that's how we do things. What would a disaster be for a human, for example? Already answered. But if we slightly change our framing, I think what we see changes as well. And most of my research, of course, is something that I've already done on the ground. So this was during the 2022 floods. I'm not going to, promote myself, but we did quite a few interesting things. For example, building these carbon neutral clean water projects that help ensure that animals and human beings don't die in droughts, which is another form of disaster, very common in Pakistan. And we also help humans and animals connect from a DEI perspective, where we don't tell them anything because we want them to acknowledge and understand that maybe that their animals or just animals in particular have the same needs as themselves or their children, like getting access to clean water, which is basically a very basic right to survive and to right to life. So we have these across the country. We have built over 1,600 of these. And the yellow dot, if you see, is just one project, and the impact is, of course, the region. And this is our work on the floods, where we rescued animals alongside human beings and provided them emergency veterinary aid because I think they deserved it. They deserve to live. And eventually, we created our country's first ever disaster zone farm animal shelter. I'm pretty sure it's the first one in the world as well, but I hope I'm wrong because it acknowledges that animals are victims of disasters. Hence, it's called Disaster Zone Farm Animal Shelter, and it's operational since start of the year. And we have space for 500 farm animals. Of course, we cannot leave humans behind, so we did provide the basic necessities to human beings as well in those disasters. We built over 500 indigenous houses because that's what people need. Normally, we think we know better. We don't. Ask the people, ask the animals. They will tell you what they feel home at. And you should give them exactly that because that's when they will feel totally comfortable. And you need that. So we built societies based on those concepts as well. This is a picture of a plant-based disaster zone school because all the schools were destroyed or closed. So we taught them from a very trauma-informed curriculum about animals and their perspectives, gave them 100% plant-based food because that was the reason why the floods actually happened. So we could not give them anything else. So very scientific, and we let the kids be kids by giving them sports and stuff, and so they could just forget temporarily that they lost everything. And of course, another example of interspecies justice is that now we're connecting those same water projects to build these green vegetable gardens across Pakistan, which solves the problem of food security and keeps the animals out of it. And of course, solves a lot of other problems as well, such as prevention of disasters and so on and so forth. This is my favorite picture because we did this year, and this is in the middle of a desert. So we firstly installed a solar water project, again carbon neutral, and then we connected that water source to build a green vegetable garden in the middle of a desert, close to a community. And so it's all connected. It solves the problem of food security, solves animal cruelty, solves the problem of climate change, prevents disasters, and makes sure that animals and humans are protected in cases of droughts, in case of food security, and so on and so forth. And we are, of course, we're still experimenting, and we're hoping to create this facility across the country. The last thing I normally want to cover is, of course, the importance of women. Something that we take very lightly, but in cases of disasters, their role is very, very important because, and I think this is very patriarchal, but still, women kind of have a better bond with animals and their families. Men normally in patriarchal societies such as Pakistan are mostly responsible for what happens outside. So while they're taking care outside, inside it's kind of the role and duty and responsibility of women, and they take care of it in the most amazing ways. So they are actually very important stakeholders because they know what their animals need, they know what the humans need, and their involvement therefore is crucial if you want to do disaster response, at least in Pakistan. So these are stories from the ground, and of course this is child labor, but it happens very commonly. I wish I could change this, but of course, what we have changed is by installing these clean water projects within their vicinities, women don't have to, or children don't have to, walk miles just one side to get clean drinking water, which was not available to them any before. Now they do, so they can, do other stuff and just be children. And it's a process. That's how we change things. But the question, therefore, is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And that I think this applies to everybody, not just animals, but to anybody who has been neglected in this world. And we are animals as well, so we are all sentient beings. Think about it. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Altamush. That was rightfully confronting as we face an increasing risk and rate of natural disasters, and we're seeing a lot of comments saying similar in the chat.